In a photograph taken at St. Agatha's Orphanage in 1922, a child appears who never existed. At first glance, the photo looks ordinary, almost forgettable. Rows of children stand shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms crisp, their postures stiff with discipline. Behind them, the caretakers and nuns loom tall, their expressions caught between pride and severity. The photograph was meant to show order and obedience, proof that the orphanage was a place of structure and faith. Yet when the eye moves across the rows of children, one face draws attention and refuses to let go. A girl, younger than most, with pale, distant eyes that seem to stare beyond the camera, not into it. Her outline is faintly blurred, as if the lens struggled to hold her. Her mouth is neither a smile nor a frown, but something in between, and the longer you look, the stranger she becomes. She looks as though she is standing there with the others, and yet, she looks as though she is not there at all. Decades later, this photograph resurfaced when the old records of St. Agatha's were being digitized. Archivists handled the fragile papers carefully, turning brittle pages of registers and ledgers that recorded every child who passed through the orphanage's doors. Among the cracked leather books and fading photographs, the picture from 1922 caught the attention of a historian. Their job was to match the names in the ledgers with the children captured in the image. It should have been simple because the orphanage kept excellent records. Each child had a file with dates, details, and even small notes about their behavior. The historian moved from face to face, cross-checking with the list. Every boy and girl was there, everyone accounted for. Every name had a face and every face had a name except one. The girl with the pale eyes had no file. The historian searched again, certain it must have been a mistake. They traced their finger over the inked names, checked the number of children in the register against the number of faces in the photo. The numbers matched perfectly, yet there was still a girl too many. No gaps, no empty lines, no indication that anyone was overlooked. Still, her face was there in the center row, looking out with that strange, detached expression. Her uniform was the same as the others, her posture fit the pattern, yet she was a ghost in the records. She did not exist on paper, and yet she had been captured in the frame. The historian later said with unease, "Every child had a file, every single one, except her." To understand the weight of that discovery, it is important to know what kind of place St. Agatha's Orphanage was. Founded in the late 1800s, it was run by strict Catholic nuns and built upon rules, silence, and routine. Life there followed a harsh rhythm. At dawn, the chapel bell rang, calling the children from their narrow beds. Meals were taken in silence under the sharp eyes of the sisters. Chores filled every hour not spent in prayer or lessons. The stone walls echoed with discipline, not laughter. Children marched in lines through the corridors, their voices hushed, their heads lowered. It was a world of order where obedience was the highest virtue, and where affection was rare. To survive there meant learning quickly and following every rule. The orphanage gathered its children from tragedy. Many had been left without parents after war, famine, or the great wave of disease that swept across the country. The great influenza had taken mothers and fathers, leaving sons and daughters in the care of strangers. Others were children of poverty, abandoned because their families could not afford to keep them. The halls of St. Agatha's carried all of these broken stories, and the photograph from 1922 was meant to show that order had been restored. It was supposed to be proof of discipline, proof of control, proof that every child had been saved and placed where they belonged. To benefactors and church officials, the image was a sign that the orphanage was doing its duty. But the photo carried more than it was meant to. Instead of a neat record of the children in that year, it showed a face that history refused to recognize. The blurred outline of the girl was not listed in the ledgers, not noted in the baptismal rolls, not named in any of the pages that should have marked her existence. She appeared only once in that single image and nowhere else. For an institution built on structure and record-keeping, this absence was impossible to explain. How could one child slip through without a trace, when every detail of life inside was carefully documented? How could she stand there so clearly among them, and yet not belong to any list? The more the historians studied the photo, the more unsettling it became. The children around her seemed unaware, their faces stiff with obedience, their bodies angled as though space had been made for her without thought. The caretakers stood behind them, unblinking, unsmiling, as if nothing was out of place. And yet, one girl did not belong to their world. She had no birth date, no record of arrival, no note of chores or punishments. She existed in a way no one else did, frozen in a single frame of time and then gone. The question began to grow like a shadow. Why would a child appear in the photo and not in reality? The historian could not let the mystery rest. The strange girl in the photograph became an obsession, a puzzle that demanded answers. Day after day the historian went back into the archives, pulling registers and baptismal logs, cross-checking each page with the faces from the photograph. Every other child could be placed, their stories fitting neatly into the official narrative. But no matter how many books were turned, the pale-eyed girl never appeared. It was as though the orphanage itself had chosen to keep her hidden, her name left off the lists, her presence denied by ink and paper. The historian searched death certificates as well, thinking perhaps she had died before her file could be completed, but even the records of graves gave nothing. Still, her face was there in the middle of the photograph, standing directly in the center row, almost as if the others had been arranged around her. It was unsettling, almost deliberate. As the historian whispered while staring at the image, it was as if they all unconsciously made room for her. The search for answers stretched beyond the archives. In the 1970s and 1980s, interviews were conducted with a few surviving orphans who had once lived at St. Agatha's. By then, they were elderly, their memories clouded by time but still sharp in flashes. When shown the photograph, their reactions varied. Some recognized the faces immediately, pointing to children they remembered from chores, lessons, or games. But when the pale-eyed girl was mentioned, the responses were divided. One man, frail and soft-spoken, insisted he had played marbles with her in the courtyard. He remembered her silence, how she would watch more than speak, and how her hands were always cold when he touched them. Yet another former orphan looked at the same face and swore she had never existed. He claimed he had never seen her, not once, and that whoever she was, she could not have lived there. The testimonies grew stranger the more they were collected. A woman who had once lived in the dormitory said she recalled a girl who never joined prayers, who sat apart at meals, and yet none of the sisters ever addressed her. She believed the staff could not see her at all, as though she were invisible to them. Another man hesitated before speaking, his voice low as he admitted he sometimes saw the girl at night, standing by the dormitory door, staring into the room without entering. His words shook with fear as he confessed he had prayed for her to go away. The contradiction between memory and record created a chilling tension. Some swore she had been real, a shadow among them, while others were equally certain she had never walked the halls of St. Agatha's. The question hung heavy in the air. How do you remember someone who never lived? The historian, desperate to find a rational solution, began to propose possible explanations. The first thought was a clerical error, that perhaps the girl's name had been forgotten in the ledgers. But this seemed almost impossible. The orphanage was known for its precise records, every child carefully noted and tracked. The handwriting in the registers was clean and deliberate, showing no sign of a skipped entry. There were no gaps where her name might have been, no torn pages or missing lines. The possibility of human error seemed too small to explain something so glaring. If she had truly been there, she should have existed on paper. Another theory was that the photograph itself was to blame. Perhaps it had been a double exposure, a mistake common in early photography where two images overlapped and created a ghostly second figure. The historian had the photo examined closely, but the experts ruled this out. There were no signs of duplication, no faint traces of repeated lines or overlapping shadows. Every child's outline was sharp and solid, except hers. She was not duplicated from another place in the frame. She stood where no one else had been. That left another unsettling question. Could she have been a hidden child? Someone placed into the photograph for reasons that had since been erased from memory. If so, who was she? Her uniform matched perfectly with the others, down to the smallest details. The fabric, the collar, the shoes, all belonged to St. Agatha's. If she had been borrowed from another place, how did her clothing blend so seamlessly with the group? The historian even considered the possibility that she had been added to the photo after it was taken, but experts dismissed that too. The quality of the old image showed no evidence of tampering. She was not pasted in, not drawn in, not added by trick. She was there when the shutter clicked. The more theories were tested, the less sense the photograph made. Every logical answer only deepened the mystery. If it was not clerical error and not photographic accident, and not the trick of memory, then what was left? Each path circled back to the same impossible truth. A girl appeared in the photograph who was not meant to exist. She had no records, no history, and no name. She was there, and yet she was not. The historian wrote in the margins of their notes a line that revealed both fear and awe. Was she erased intentionally, or was she never alive to begin with? The historian requested high-resolution scans of the photograph, hoping that modern technology could expose what the naked eye could not. When the image was placed under digital magnification, strange details began to emerge that unsettled even the most rational minds. The pale-eyed girl's outline was softer than the rest, as if the photograph itself resisted holding her shape. Where the other children had crisp edges, she appeared to fade slightly into the background. More disturbing still was what appeared near her shoes. Unlike the other children, whose feet rested firmly on the ground, her shoes were blurred, as though she were hovering a fraction above the earth. The shadows cast by the children fell consistently in one direction, but when the light was traced across her figure, no shadow followed her. She stood in the center of the group, but she was untouched by the same laws that defined the others. As the historian whispered while staring at the scan, she was standing among them, yet untouched by light. These discoveries sent the historian digging not only into the archives but into the whispered stories that had long surrounded St. Agatha's. The orphanage had always carried a reputation darker than its whitewashed walls suggested. Children spoke of cruel punishments that went unrecorded, of long nights locked in cold rooms, and of voices in the chapel that sang when no one was there. Behind the chapel itself, the land was said to hold unmarked graves, places where no headstones stood, only patches of uneven soil. Neighbors claimed to hear girls singing after nightfall, their voices faint and mournful. Staff were known to avoid certain corridors, whispering about footsteps echoing when no one walked. Local folklore grew around the place, painting it as a house not only of discipline but of shadows. Perhaps, some said, the camera had captured what the living chose to ignore. The more the historian investigated, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. Eventually, while searching through the orphanage's basement storage, a sealed wooden box was found buried beneath stacks of discarded furniture and rotting hymnals. Inside, the papers were damaged by damp and smoke, but a few pages could still be read. Among them lay a half-burnt record that drew immediate attention. The page had once contained a list of names, but one entry had been scratched out violently, leaving only the first letter visible, E. Below the erased name were notes written in hurried, uneven script. They spoke of disciplinary actions, of repeated disobedience, of a child who would not follow rules. Yet just as the record began to build, the page ended abruptly, the remaining words lost to fire and decay. The violence of the erasure was undeniable. Someone had tried to remove this child from existence, blotting out her name from every trace of ink and paper. But the photograph proved their attempt was incomplete. As the historian held the brittle page, one thought echoed in their mind. Someone tried to erase her, but not completely. The discovery of the half-burnt file changed the investigation. Until then, the girl had been only a mystery in a photograph, an unexplained shadow on paper. But now there was proof that someone with the initial E had existed in the records, if only briefly. The sharp scratches across the name suggested not an accident but intent. Whoever erased her wanted no trace to remain. Yet why would a child be erased with such fury? The notes that survived hinted at disobedience, but discipline was common at St. Agatha's. Many children had been punished, and their records remained intact. Why destroy hers completely? The historian stared at the page, chilled by the thought that removing her from the ledgers was not enough. Someone wanted her forgotten, as if she had never lived. And yet, against all efforts, her face still lingered, fixed forever in the photograph. The historian began to wonder if the photograph itself had become a kind of defiance. If every file, every ledger, and every certificate had been altered to erase her, the camera had done the opposite. It had held on to her when no one else would. The faint blur around her outline seemed almost like resistance, as though the world itself had tried to push her out and failed. Her lack of shadow, her hovering shoes, her pale, unyielding stare. These were not just flaws in an image, but signs of something that did not obey the rules of the living. Perhaps she had not been captured by accident at all. Perhaps she had forced her way into that moment, refusing to vanish completely from the story of St. Agatha's. The thought unsettled the historian most of all. What if the photograph was the girl's way of being remembered? Holding the burnt file in one hand and the scanned image in the other, the historian felt trapped between two truths that could not exist together. One truth was that the records declared she had never lived at St. Agatha's. The other truth was that the camera had captured her as surely as it had captured every other child. Both could not be right, and yet both were undeniable. This contradiction gnawed at the historian's mind, a riddle with no answer. Late at night, while studying the faint letters and blurred edges, the historian admitted a thought that would not go away. Perhaps she was never meant to be erased. Perhaps the harder the past tried to silence her, the louder her image became. And perhaps that was why, even a century later, strangers looking at the photograph felt her cold eyes fixed upon them, daring them to remember what the world tried to forget. The search for answers brought forward many theories, and each was unsettling in its own way. The first was supernatural, the idea that the girl was the ghost of a child who had died before the photograph was taken. The pale eyes, the absence of a shadow, and the faint blur all fit the image of a restless spirit. If she had been buried in secret or died before her name was properly recorded, perhaps her spirit lingered at St. Agatha's, slipping into the frame when the children gathered. But even that did not explain why some of the surviving orphans swore they remembered her, while others insisted she never existed. How could a ghost be remembered by some but not all? And why would she appear only once, never again in another photograph, never again in another account? The ghost theory explained something, but it left just as many questions behind. A second theory was psychological. Some argued that the girl was nothing more than a trick of memory, a collective false memory shared by those who had lived through hardship and trauma. Children at St. Agatha's had suffered loss, fear, and isolation. In such conditions, it was possible they had imagined a companion who was never there. Over time, that imagined figure may have been remembered as real, blurring the line between fact and memory. Yet the flaw in this theory was obvious: the photograph. False memory could explain stories told decades later, but it could not explain the physical evidence captured on camera. The girl was not just a memory. She was there, in the photograph, in the center row, with her pale eyes staring out. Memory might deceive, but the lens should not have lied. The final theory was the most disturbing, and it carried the weight of conspiracy. What if the girl had been real, but deliberately erased from the records because of scandal or abuse? Institutions of the time were known to bury their secrets. If a child had died under suspicious circumstances, or if punishment had gone too far, the sisters may have chosen to destroy her records entirely. The half-burnt file with the scratched-out name seemed to support this. Perhaps the child had been a problem. Perhaps her death had brought shame, and erasing her was the only way to protect the orphanage's reputation. It was possible she had been silenced in life and in death, but the camera had caught her before the erasure was complete. The historian admitted this possibility felt chilling because it was human, not supernatural. To erase a child with such care meant cruelty beyond measure. And yet, even this theory failed to close the gaps. If she had been erased so carefully, why had one fragile photograph survived? Why had her face been preserved at all? These questions haunted the historian until one final discovery seemed to provide the most chilling answer of all. But one theory chills the most: The breakthrough came when forensic imaging experts were asked to examine the photograph in layers, pulling every detail that the old print had hidden. Under careful analysis, the girl's face was compared to the known portraits of the orphans from the early 1920s. The results were shocking. She did not match a single one of the children from the year 1922. Her features, however, bore a strong resemblance to a girl who had lived at the orphanage the year before. Her name was Evelyn. She had been admitted in 1919 at the age of 8, and according to the burial logs of the town, she had died in 1921 of fever. The grave that held her was listed in the unmarked field behind the chapel, one of the many small mounds of earth without a stone to tell her story. If the records were to be believed, Evelyn was gone a full year before the photograph was ever taken. And yet, there she was, standing among the living in 1922, her pale eyes fixed on the camera, her body faint and blurred but undeniable. The historian could not shake the weight of the discovery. The orphanage could bury her body, but not her memory. Evelyn had been placed in the earth with no headstone, no prayer, and no legacy. But somehow, when the children gathered for the annual photograph, she returned to take her place among them. It was as if the act of erasure had only made her presence stronger. Every attempt to scratch her name from paper, every effort to burn her file, every silence in the records had failed. The camera had seen her, and once it did, she could not be hidden again. Her eyes in the photo seemed to accuse the viewer, to demand that she be remembered despite every effort to forget. The photograph was no longer just a document of orphans in 1922. It was Evelyn's refusal to disappear. When the findings were released, the reactions were divided. Historians were unsettled, unsure whether to trust the evidence or dismiss it as coincidence. Paranormal researchers, however, seized on the story, claiming it was proof of life beyond death, proof that memory itself could leave a mark strong enough to outlast the grave. The orphanage remained silent, refusing to answer questions or acknowledge the discovery. Meanwhile, the photograph spread quickly, shared in books, lectures, and eventually online. People stared into the pale eyes of the blurred girl, debating whether she was a ghost, a forgotten child, or something else entirely. The image became a symbol of the unexplained, a reminder that some stories refuse to be buried. The historian could not ignore what the photograph revealed, and in quiet moments, the thought became unbearable. Records, no matter how carefully preserved, were not perfect truths. They could be altered, destroyed, rewritten to suit the needs of those in power. For centuries, institutions had erased inconvenient lives, the unwanted, the troublesome, the ones who died in silence. A single missing page could erase a person as though they had never lived, their existence reduced to nothing more than ashes at the bottom of a furnace. Yet memory was harder to silence. In the case of Evelyn, the photograph stood like a rebellion against the official story. The camera did not lie in the way men could, and its lens captured what ink tried to deny. Even after the files were burned, even after her name was scratched away, Evelyn's pale face looked back through time. The photograph became proof that memory does not always obey the rules of history. Perhaps history remembers more than we want it to. The more the historians studied the photo, the more disturbing questions began to rise. If Evelyn had returned in the frame despite her absence in the records, what if she was not the only one? How many other children had been erased before their stories could be told? St. Agatha's had its whispers of punishments and unmarked graves, but surely it was not the only institution with such shadows. Across the world, there were orphanages, asylums, schools, and hospitals that kept incomplete archives, where children could vanish without leaving a trace. The historian began to wonder how many faces in old photographs belonged to people who never existed. What if every faded yearbook, every stiff family portrait, every grainy image from the past carried not just the living, but also the forgotten, those who had been erased on paper, yet remained in the frame? It became impossible to look at old photographs the same way again. A crowd of children in stiff uniforms might not only represent the documented lives, but also the hidden ones, the Evelyns of the past. The idea was terrifying because it meant the camera, without anyone realizing, could have preserved evidence of entire lives denied by the official record. It meant that the forgotten might still be staring at us from their frozen places in history, daring us to remember them. The photo of Evelyn was no longer just about one child. It was about the possibility that many more had been lost in silence. The final question lingered, cold and unshakable. If a photograph can remember the forgotten, what else is watching us from the past?